I want to share some thoughts and get you to do an exercise with me to explore this idea of leadership. And I'm going to start with probably one of the world's greatest sketch notes, don't you think, Saskia? For those that don't know, Saskia did this sketch note for us. But for me and for Jeremy, when we think about leadership, this picture captures a lot of what we're thinking about, which is, for us, leadership is less about directing people, about creating followers and, you know, all that sort of stuff, and much more about enabling people. And that can look like a couple of different things. It can look like helping people to unpack, discover, co-create a sense of what really matters around here. And we talk about that as clearing the fog of complexity. So we all live in a really complex world. Our businesses, no matter what we do, are not simple. You know, there's lots of interconnection between people, but also between structures and processes. And all of that makes it quite difficult at times to see what really matters and to stay focused on it. So one of the things we think about when we think about leadership at Easy Rink is, can we make it easier to find and focus on what really matters? A second thing that relates to that is, can we make it easier to do what really matters, not just to focus on it? So we know that policies and processes and roles and measures and all sorts of things can add friction to the way that work works. In other words, it can make it a bit harder to get what we really want to do done. So work to act on friction. And the third F, or maybe the fourth F, so we've got fog, focus, friction, and the fourth one is fellowship. We think that what it takes to find our way through the fog, to stay focused on what really matters, and to remove the friction that makes doing it easier, is actually to invest in relationships, to really see the world as a process of, if you like, winning together, or in other words, finding ways to mutually meet each other's needs, including the needs of, if we're in private business, customers. But if we're in public sector, it's perhaps meeting the needs and making the most of the strengths of citizens, communities, and so on. And we talk about that as fellowship. So if you wanted a single slide that gives you, if you like, our general approach to leadership, I think this one gets pretty close. But to help us understand why do Jeremy and I see the world this way, I wanted to invite you to play a game with me. So you'll need to be off mute to take part in this. Don't feel you have to take part, but if you're willing, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, so this little matrix that we're going to go through is derived from a lady, Diana Baumrind, who was a student of Chris Argyris. If you've heard of Chris Argyris, he's one of the sort of founding fathers of the learning organization, Action Learning and things like that. And Diana Baumrind was interested in how Argyris's work applied to the world of parenting. And she diagnosed 4 core parenting strategies and suggested that there are predictable impacts that these strategies have on children raised in this way. And I want to take the analogy between parenting and leadership, not because I think it's a direct analogy, but because I think it gives us some insight. So for this little exercise, it's all going to get really rather weird. I'm going to be dad and you're going to be my kids, okay? So here goes. All right, we're going to start in the top left box where I have lots of very clear rules. And forgive my language, but I don't really give a shit about what you think of them. Yeah, my house, my rules. If you want to live around here, you're going to do what I say. And by the way, shut up while you're doing it. Okay. So obviously that's the model of leadership we want, right? That's certainly how I parent. I hope not. Okay, so over to you for a minute, kids. If that was me as dad and that was my normal way of bringing you up, how might you behave and respond? What sorts of things might you do or not do? Just shout out.
You're probably going to rebel.
Ah, don't shout out. We've established shouting out doesn't work very quickly. Wave your hand and I will pick you to shout out. Okay, so that is, I think, Tamara, was it?
Yeah.
And Michael as well.
I can't see the names, sadly. Okay, so Tamara.
Yeah. So one way we might respond is by doing as we're told. We might.
Exactly. So you might comply, and maybe there's a risk in that. Maybe it's unthinking compliance.
Oh yeah.
So who have we got there? We've got
Lois
and Michael, and I'm really sorry, I can't see the other name there. But the lady with the headphones. Okay, so we'll go Lois first, then Michael, then lady with the headphones. Lois.
What I would do is I would pretend that I was abiding to your rules, and when I left the house, I would be doing exactly what I wanted. If you told me that I couldn't go to that concert, I'd say, right, okay, that's fine. I'm stopping at such a body's house, my best mate, and then we'd go off to that concert, and you've been none the wiser.
Yep. Absolutely. So you can probably already see the parallels to organizational behavior here. So there's kind of subverting the rules while keeping me blind to the reality. Michael.
You may just openly rebel and say that you're not going to put up with the rules and the lack of respect, and you're just going to do your own thing.
Absolutely. I've got my eye on you, Michael. I absolutely know what you're like. Okay, and apologies, the lady with the headphones. Would you mind letting me know your name? I'll try and remember.
I'm Judy.
Judy, thank you.
I will not only pretend, subvert, I'll probably get really traumatized by the whole thing and end up in counselling and alcoholism and all sorts of things. Going to be some quite deep-rooted trauma here, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's tea I'm drinking, by the way. Okay, so you're exactly right, and look, this is essentially what Baumrind says. So there are a whole range of behaviours that she diagnoses, but amongst them, you touched on rebellion, you touched on subversion, you touched on the sort of hypervigilance as well. That what I'm going to do is I'm going to live my life absolutely, in fear of your judgment and consequence, and in organisations, I think we see these behaviours, not in every organisation, not all of the time, not from everyone, but if you like, it's a percentage game here, that leading and parenting in this top left way produces predictable sort of pathologies in our behaviour, damages transparency, and it leads to, I think, really dangerous things like that unthinking compliance that we touched on at first, where we do what we're told, not because it's the right thing to do, but just because it's the thing we're told to do. So hopefully I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that we don't really want to be in that top left box. So let's try the bottom left box. So I'm back as dad. This time, good news, kids, there are no rules. I don't really give a damn about rules, but that's because I don't give a damn about anything, including you. So could you please just get on with your life? I'll get on with mine. And please stay out of my way because I've got beer to drink and football to watch. Bit stereotypical, I accept, but that's definitely me on a Sunday. Back to you, kids. How might you respond if that was the way I parented? Yeah. So now, Tamara, thank you.
So might indulge in ever-increasing attention-seeking behaviour. It's like you don't care. So how do I, sort of draw attention to myself, really? Because it sounds like you're not paying any attention.
Absolutely. Well, that's bang on. So, because I don't care and it's important to be loved, there's a sort of almost like a cry for help sort of behavior. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, go on, Judy. Remember this time.
Yeah, when you need something from me later on, you can sod off because, you've done nothing for me. So look after your own wheelchair, granddad.
Yeah, absolutely. So that idea of fellowship that I talked about earlier and relationships, I mean, they just don't exist. Yeah. Lois.
Sorry, I muted myself again. I might go and find my connections and my links and my, you know, love and respect elsewhere. And these might not necessarily be the perfect people for me, but I'll go and find it somewhere else.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we do see that in these sorts of environments. So people go in and, you know, desperate to find value in their life and in the world, they go and find people that show them that value. But as you rightly identify, you know, the research suggests that those people aren't necessarily always the healthiest people to have relationships with, or the environments they find themselves in aren't always the healthiest. So you're quite right. And again, you know, this is what Baumrind says. She talks about how this sort of environment in childhood can breed apathy, certainly will predispose low self-worth. And with that leads to sort of negligent behaviors, both to oneself and to others, because you haven't really been role modeled how to have healthy, productive, mutual relationships. Again, I'd emphasize it's a percentage game here. There are people who are raised in all of these environments who will behave differently. And in this bottom left box, we do see examples of people who sort of say, you know what, screw you, Dad. I'm worth something, and I know I'm worth something. And the fact you don't value me just means that I don't value your opinion. So there are always opportunities for people to kind of better the circumstances from which they've come. But again, playing the percentage game as leaders, if we take the parallel to organizations, I would suggest it's not likely to help people give their best and feel their best about their work if we're not really respecting them, and if we're not providing sufficient structure for people to find their way in the world and to know what really matters around here. Okay, so let's jump over to the bottom right box. I'm Dad again, and this time, good news, kids, because I really love you. In fact, I love you so much that we don't need rules, because whatever you do is fine by me. How might you respond then?
This is what I call princess syndrome.
Go on, Lois, I like it.
You can end up becoming a total princess. So you think that you, everything you do is right, and everything you can do no wrong, and everybody should adore you and respect you and love you, just like your parents. Absolutely,
yes. Yeah. So if we're not careful, we create people who feel entitled to praise and respect and love and value and all of that. And in a sense, of course, we're entitled to love and those things, but there has to be some sense of responsibility that comes with this, doesn't there? Without responsibility, we just get entitlement. Michael?
It may kind of foster a position where you have no boundaries, and so you just don't take very kindly to any notion of being kind of critically challenged.
Absolutely. So yeah, so the absence of boundaries, the absence of any sort of feedback or sense of responsibility, again, leaves us feeling like the world exists for us. Yeah. Usually at this point, I dare to risk political harm, but I'm just going to say Donald Trump right out the gates. Yeah. So if I'm suspecting, looking at those on the call, we don't have many Donald Trump supporters here, but this is the sort of behavior we get. And again, this is what Baumrind talks about, you know, entitlement, potentially laziness. You know, if I'm going to be praised and rewarded anyway, why would I bother trying for it? Some really interesting behaviors here as well, though, that can be counterintuitive, which is actually people down here can end up deeply lacking in resilience, because they become so dependent on love and praise that, having been accustomed to that in childhood, when they meet the real world and they're not getting it from everyone all of the time, they can't cope. So you can get actually quite different behaviors here. You can get people who just crumble in the face of reality, and then you get people who are so full of their sense of entitlement that reality is never even going to touch them. Yeah. Just a quick aside here, but I saw a really interesting example of how I think this box plays out in organizations working in a really large corporate. They had a sort of gifted and talented type program for the very best of the best, as they saw them. And what had happened, having run this program for a while, was they'd started to notice that people who had been genuinely, you know, really forward-thinking, take the initiative, creative sort of people, had been put on the gifted and talented program, had been told that they're fantastic, and over a period of time had started to adopt behaviors that look very much like the behaviors in this box, because we'd sort of told them that, you know, they were better than everyone else. And the minute that they got feedback, and the minute that they were invited to think that maybe they're talented there but not so talented here, they became hostile to that, in essence. So I'm not saying don't have gifted and talented programs, but I think be aware that this idea of dealing in praise, dealing in kind of giving people blobs and stars and, you know, things on their shoulder to show how clever they are, can be a really dangerous thing to do. So, so far so bad. Yeah. So let's hope there's good news in the top right box, or we can pack up and go home. But let's see where we might get. So if I'm dad again, and this time in this parenting strategy, I'm going to say, look, kids, obviously I'm, you know, deeply committed to helping you in your life, but we need to work together in order to all have a good life around here. And that means that we do have to have some rules if we're going to live happily under this roof. Yeah. Now, those rules are going to be for us to talk about and to work out together. Yeah. We need to have them, but we need to work out together what good's going to look like so that we can get along and so that we can have a good life together. How do you feel about that? So if I behaved in a way something like that, how might you respond?
It gives us a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there will be different views on this, but I'll just give you my view that there's something I think deeply important in order to get into this top right box about the co-creation of the rules. So that point about responsibility, I think, is key, because it's not responsibility for following my rules. That just takes us back to the top left. But it's responsibility for thinking about what rules do we need and how are those rules helping us. Yeah. Anyone else? Lois.
I think this helps you with your sense of recognition. So in social pedagogy, what we talk about a lot is our sense of self and our sense of recognition as human beings. So if it means if you are going to co-produce the rules with me or listen, or there's going to be that flexibility, it means that you respect me and recognize me as a human being, somebody that you care about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the rules have to be born out of the real relationships between the real people in this context. So the rules are deeply contextual because they're bound up in who these people are, what their strengths are, what their needs are, how they interrelate, and so on. So it's not a case of, you know, we have a team over here who are the pilot team who come up with the rules, and then we just roll those rules out. Yeah, absolutely. Any other takers? Okay, well, let's move on. So there's time for questions and such if we need it at the end of this. But what Baumrin talks about is that in this top right box, where this is our strategy for how we parent rather than just a thing we do occasionally, we do get that sense of responsibility. We get people who actually grow up with a sense of purpose because they have a sense of who they are and how they're making their way in the world. And they also, and for me, this is the thing that I really hold on to most tightly, is they actually learn to if you like, be in a habit of empathy. So in order to co-create rules that are effective, they have to be putting themselves in other people's shoes, and they have to be doing that in a way in which they aren't neglecting their own needs and strengths. So it's also empathy with the self. And I think the role of these three things, responsibility, purpose, and empathy, in creating that fellowship that I talked about at the top, feels absolutely central to me. So when I think about leadership, my kind of rule of thumb is I think about, are we behaving in this top right box sort of way? And the key thing about this top right box is that it makes leadership a team sport. So it's not I, the hierarchical leader, as dad, yeah? It's us, the group of people who have to create this fellowship together, have to win together. And therefore, leadership becomes actually a responsibility that is there on all of us. Okay, so this is one way to think about leadership, and I just want to pull it together quickly with a couple of other final thoughts before we have a discussion. So when I think about that little game, this is what I think it roughly adds up to. So it adds up to remembering that it is important that we have a sense of what really matters, and that we use that sense to make sure that what we think really matters is what really matters here. So, you know, whether we call them rules or principles or quotas or whatever it is, we need something to anchor us to what matters here, and we need to use that. Otherwise, it's a free-for-all. And we can call that leadership if we want. That's the word I've used for it here. But I think leadership in the sense that has value only works alongside this idea of fellowship. And for me, that means remembering and displaying through our action that what really matters here includes having an understanding of what really matters to each other. And more than an understanding, it includes actually factoring that into our thinking and action. So for me, you can't really disentangle leadership from fellowship or fellowship from leadership. They're bound up in each other. And I think there's one other thing that I want to touch on, which we might call stewardship. And this has, I think, different meanings in practice, depending on what type of organization we're in and what type of role we hold. So for a formal leader, someone that has, if you like, formal power high up a hierarchy, this idea of stewardship can be about taking action to really shift the structures and processes and policies and rules of the system to make it easier for people, because you have some control over those. But for everyone, there is a role of stewardship, because we can at the very least flag the things that are getting in our way and making our ability to focus on and do what really matters harder than it should be. And in that sense, we all can play a role in stewardship. So I just want to dig into that very briefly, a little deeper in two ways. The first one is this idea of the sometimes seeming dichotomy between structure and agency. So we hear lots of stuff about, you know, take a good person, put them in a bad system, and the bad system will win every day of the week. And that may be an empirical truth, but in order to change any system, we need people to have agency. And I think when we think about leadership, all leadership for me starts with agency. So for those formal leaders high up the hierarchy, when they're thinking of their stewardship role, one of the most effective things they can do is they can show agency to understand the friction created by the current structures of the system, the policies, the measures, the processes, the role design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can then act on the structures of the system to remove or mitigate the friction. And when they do that, they unlock more agency in others. They make it easier for others to show leadership, fellowship, and stewardship. Yeah. So thinking about that in practical terms, you know, so long as we have things like a 4-hour target in A&E, we're always going to be pushing water uphill with a fork, trying to change that system. So that doesn't mean we can't do things while that measure exists. It just means that we'll be able to do so much more, so much faster, if we remove measures like that and replace them with other things. It's not enough to just get rid of them. Yeah, we still need structures. We just need structures that work. So that's a role for formal leadership. And as I said, for those that maybe don't have formal power, a role is just to flag these frictions and their impact so that things can be done about them. But there's a second thing, which is not about structure as such. It's just about behavioral norms and sort of social understandings. And for me, this is one that, again, whether you're high up a hierarchy or not, we all have an opportunity to influence. And again, it starts with agency, which is the more that any of us as individuals show and invite others to show agency. For example, in flagging the issues that affect our work, in standing up for what we think really matters, in reminding each other when we've forgotten someone else that that someone else matters too. So kind of showing agency for that practice of systematic empathy that I touched on. I think each of us can live that, embody that, demonstrate that to others, invite others to demonstrate that. And when we do so, we don't just do it as a random instance that bounces off the system and disappears. The more we do that, we know that behavior is reciprocal, and the more of that we're going to unlock in others. So I think it doesn't matter where we are in the hierarchy. I think what this all adds up to for me is that we all have 3 roles in our lives at work. So there's the one about leadership, you know, standing up for what really matters and taking the time to really unpack and uncover what really matters. There's the one about fellowship, just remembering that what matters includes what matters to each other. And there's this one about stewardship, which is about demonstrating systematic empathy, flagging the issues that affect our work, and if we have the power, directly acting on the issues that affect our work and the work of others.